People are physically sick in the workplaces, people who can't go into work. £28 billion a year is lost to the UK economy due to this conflict. That's £1,000 per employee.
Today's guest is David Liddle. He is the founder and CEO of the TCM Group. The TCM Group is a leading and multi-award winning conflict management, culture change, and leadership development consultancy.
House always wins. You've just been dealt a card the minute you walked into the casino. It's called the employee handbook. The croupier is the HR department. I've never met anyone who's ever gone through a grievance procedure and come out of the other side of it and said, yes, that is the best thing I could have possibly done. I'm more productive. I'm happier at work. The grievance and disciplinary procedures, they are the biggest barrier.
Can you get rid of them?
As we are already seeing, the nature of work shifted and this emergence of this new epoch of work, which I've simply called transformational. I've created a resolution framework as an alternative to the discipline and grievance procedures. I talked about that's what the BBC have adopted, and I'd be very keen to discuss it with you.
Hello and welcome to The Power Between. I'm very excited to have with me today David Liddle. David, welcome.
Thank you very much, Roddy. It's a real pleasure to be here today.
I'm really excited to have you. You're obviously a big name, David. You've been around in the world of HR and particularly conflict resolution for a considerable amount of time, and the TCM Group, various other associations that have sustained your career. The best thing to do this conversation off is give sort of highlights rather than me trying to pick them out for you, and we'll take it forward from there.
Thanks so much, Roddy. It really is a genuine pleasure to be here having a conversation with you today. So yeah, as you said, David, I'm very flattered to think of a big name. I'm 6'4", so I'm a big person.
You're a big lad too, then.
A big lad. I am enjoying about my career at the moment is I've been 25 years ago, Roddy, I set my business up 2001, primarily as a mediation and conflict resolution business. You know, I was working with organizations who were very embarrassed to talk about conflict, and having someone like me coming in was something that was an expression of failure, and it was all very hidden away, and I was pulled into the basements of organizations to work. I think the reason perhaps my name is bigger, but I'm not sure it's my name per se. I think there's a dawning realization within our management populations, our people teams, within our executive suites, how we deal with difference, conflict, falling outs, how we manage change effectively, and how we create really purposeful organizations is centered around how we treat each other, how we resolve difference, how we communicate, how we unlock the insight and the learning, the growth that comes through challenge. So whilst there's a mediated restorative practices in our communities and society, in our workplaces, they're now starting to be recognized and becoming a strategic priority in organizations who want to get the best from their people. Because of course, I think what I've learned is when organizations get the best from their people and create a people-first approach centered around a really positive culture where we can show up and do our best work and be treated with dignity and with respect, and happiness and healthiness and harmony become kind of key metrics on the corporate dashboard. Actually, it's those organizations which are driving productivity and performance on the very day where we just started to see the organization regressing into negative growth terms. And my message to organizations was, and always will be, if we want to do economic growth and productivity well as an economy, we need to start putting people first. And I think that message is cutting through now, and it's such an exciting time to be part of this movement.
100% with you. It seems baffling to me that governments spend so much time trying to increase productivity. Growth is clearly languishing in historic terms, and there's so much focus on it. And yet no one ever seems to look at the people side of it. It's always looked at through the investment hardware sort of process side of it. There is an easy win if we run organizations better in terms of how people are motivated and sort of inspired to perform. Doesn't seem to ever get terribly much airtime.
I mean, a third runway at Heathrow is important. You know, we kind of drive in economic growth, but we can't just drive growth through third runways in Heathrow and elsewhere. New runways in our organizations, places for us to land. And I'm not sure where this metaphor is going to go, but let's go with it. If we're going to drive economic
we'll fly
growth,
with it anyway.
We can
continue.
fly. I think this metaphor could work, actually, Roddy. We're going to see where this goes. But, you know, we need to be able to invest in our people. How do we attract the top talent? How do we treat people when they're in the work? How do we create harmony and a connection between the needs of our workforce and the needs of our organization without perpetuating that concept of entitlement cultures and unhealthy, toxic workplaces, but recognizing that when we create that deep sense of understanding and connection and common purpose within the organization, we can take off and we can fly. And that then in and of itself is delivering economic advantage. Now, we might only be talking on an individual level, a small increase in discretionary effort, a little bit friendlier to a customer, staying on a little bit later to finish that project, working a little bit harder in that particular clinical environment or wherever I work. And on an individual basis, it might feel that tiny percentage increase is negligible. But hang on, whoa, let's look at that across the economy and think about that at scale. And we start to aggregate those changes at scale. And then we start to see the economic axis beginning to tilt and shift, not just through this people-centered approach, but in terms of productivity, performance, bottom line growth, and also the growth for our people and the benefit on our customers. And I think for me, the message to politicians, to business leaders and others is to balance the economic strategy around infrastructure and growth vis-a-vis macroeconomics with the need for us to focus on people economics and focus on people and culture as a key strategic priority that has to move to the top of the inbox of every rational thinking leader in our organizations if we're going to get this right.
What's, to my mind, so frustrating is that, the research shows, and as you've alluded to, but the research is very clear that those organizations that are people first, sort of human-centered, employee-focused, whatever phrase they care to use, do better. Their performance is, and usually not just marginally better, often exponentially better. And that's been going on for years. If we go back to the sort of conscious capitalism type movement of Raj Sisodia in his books, that they were showing, outperforming their peers who weren't doing that kind of thing by 4 or 5 times. And that was 25 years ago.
And there's so much data. I mean, one Gallup's sort of survey that comes to mind, and so there are so many now. So 4 times more likely to be engaged at our workplaces if we're working in a positive culture. This is some Gallup research that was published recently. 6 times almost more likely to recommend the organization as a great place to work. 62% less burnout through stress in our organizations, and over 43% less likely to go in search of alternative employment. So it's keeping people in our organizations, attracting people to the organizations, improving the branding of our organizations, and creating spaces where we can do our best work. And it's interesting. I've interviewed 2. As you mentioned, I run an organization called the People and Culture Association. So we do these transforming work video casts, and I interview chief people officers and chief executive officers. And I've done two this week, 2 fantastic interviews. And I think there's a pattern and a trend emerged, Roddy, because both of the chief executive officers that I spoke to today said very, very clearly that they put people and culture as the number 1 strategic priority on their corporate agenda and on their strategic agenda to drive bottom line growth within the balance sheet of the organization. So I think there's a really important message about how do we do this? I suppose the challenge, and I'd be very keen to discuss it with you, is how do we then measure the value such that when we're fighting for finite resources and time and so on, that we can prioritize this and keep it as a priority, not an initiative or a bolt-on or an addendum to a meeting, but as a primary focus in our boardrooms and our executive suites and across our management population more widely within the organization. Because when we get to that bit and we can demonstrate the value, then I think it becomes a key part, a key feature, if you will, of our organization's strategy, systems, institutions, cultures, and norms.
You have lots of interaction with senior leaders, people at the top of organizations, and what we hear, and I think it's true, is that the senior leadership team, the CEO, inevitably sets the tone of the culture in an organization. They can't do it all themselves. It has to be disseminated and run, go down through the cascade through the entire organization. But if you are in an organization that is not people first, that is not human centered from the top, if they're very focused on commercial KPIs and just getting stuff done, without understanding the human system part of that. Yeah, particularly if you're in the middle, and we're here to talk about mid-level leaders. It's a much bigger challenge. It's not an impossible challenge, but it's a much bigger challenge to try and create that change. What's your sort of suggestions around that?
Yeah, I think it's a really, really, really important point. I think to the point around leaders shaping the culture of the organization, it is absolutely right. Some people tell me the fish rots from the head and it's all about leadership. I'm not into boss bashing. I think it's very easy to fall into boss bashing, but I don't think we could ignore the powerful influence that the leader has as the role model, the pace setter, the standard setter, driving the organization forward, the vision, the strategy, the purpose, the mission. So it's a fundamental role. But the best organizations that I work with, and the most, I think, successful organizations, recognize that culture, like leadership, becomes distributed across the organizations. And truly transformational leaders are distributing power. They're sharing power across the organization. And a great starting point for that is with your executive team and then with your management population within the organization. So what does that actually look like and feel like in terms of creating a positive workplace culture? I think the first one is setting out the vision and then giving people the tools and the resources, the structure and the infrastructure to have it in the Daniel Pink sort of terms in positive psychology, the mastery on autonomy and purpose to do their best work. So we get in, find out what the constraints are, find out what the blockages are, what the challenges are, provide the resources to support them, and then get out of the way. And then feeding constantly, coaching, mentoring, feedback loops as a leader. That's sort of drawing on those principles of course, servant leadership or transformational leadership principles. And then seeing as that cascades down through the organization, it doesn't just come down from the top, it also comes bottom up and sideways in. It also comes from the external, political, economic, technological, the AI factors that are coming in from the outside. But it's also driven, Roddy, by the conversations that we're having in our depots, our shop floors, our clinics, our wards, our operating centres, whatever they might be. And it's a really powerful message, I think, for managers and colleagues that you meet the leadership shape and structure. You are also a culture catalyst. And what I mean by that is it's the conversations that you're having. It's the kind of climate we're developing within our teams. It's the behaviors, our actions, interactions, and reactions. The air that as managers we breathe out, that everyone breathes in, the climate within the team. And of course, when they aggregate and they're positive, values-based, person-centered, purposeful, supportive, constructive, challenging. We love a bit of challenge. It's not all about having the sort of a big hug. This is about good challenge conversations as well. But when that aggregates, it kind of aggregates to support the culture and it meets those leadership capabilities I was talking about a moment ago. And that's when I think we start to see what I call a transformational culture, a truly transformational culture. And that's when purpose, value, strategy align with behaviors, mindsets, language, interactions. And that, I think, it's those cultures that, to me, are the organizations which will succeed when we start to see, as we are already seeing, the nature of work shifting and this emergence of this new epoch of work, which I very simply call transformationalism.
The new epoch. And is a generational thing?
It's a phenomenally exciting thing. It's so exciting to think about. So if we think about sort of the unitarist period, sort of pre the millennium, the sort of infrastructure, the kind of the rise of structure around HR processes, the Ulrich model, we started to see the rise of HR, and then we started to see sort of union and this sort of persistent sort of combative nature within the organization. But these two functions, employer and employee, were starting to become organized, and we start to see organized structures in our workplaces. So we've moved much more through pluralism, the kind of recognition, and we start to see the rise of, for instance, of equity, diversity, and inclusion programs, giving people voice, bringing people together, celebrating diversity, more pluralism in our organizations. But EDI didn't answer all of the questions, and it started to look at what's the rules-based system in our workplace? How do we lead? How do we shape our organizations? What's the role of leaders? And things started to fragment. There's almost been this sort of postmodernism, fragmentation, quite chaotic period where we've been challenging all of these norms. And I think a lot of them, I've been personally challenging the grievance and disciplinary procedure, Roddy. I perceive them as the most pernicious and corrosive, divisive processes that exist in our modern workplace. I'm one of a number of voices. So I've been out there banging the drum about the retributive and reductive systems that organizations developed through the unitarist period that just don't fit anymore. But what I'm seeing now in organizations is this embracing of all of those principles I've described about, but a new rules-based system, which is emerging where compliance and regulation and system and structure meet fairness and justice, equity, understanding. And in that justice system and that kind of new framework that's being developed, that connection between leaders, managers, employees, unions, and others, we're starting to see these very creative hubs. So I create culture hubs, for instance, which generate creativity and insight, coming together to have these big conversations. And that's the transformational nature of work. And in the future of work, where pretty much everything's going to be able to be AI'd to one extent or another, or automated, the concept of the human at work has never been challenged more. We've never had a better opportunity to define the role that humans play at work. What's the best thing that we bring in our workplace? Innovation, creativity, empathy, connection, the ability to challenge the norms in the status quo, to disrupt. We can't do that when we're squabbling and falling out of fighting. We can't do that when we're at home feeling sick. We can't do that when we're feeling oppressed in our office. We feel that. We can only do that when we have these incredible moments that matter in the workplace. And that might be when we disagree, when there's a change process, when there's a new cultural structure that's being evolved, when we're going through a merger and acquisition. So there's a real interesting rethink going on about these spaces at work. And that's the shift into transformationalism. But to do that, we have to let go of some of the bureaucratic structures and systems that have been designed into the architecture of the workplaces, which do nothing more than limit and undermine the best of us as human beings. I would argue things like discipline, grievance, whistleblowing, performance, bullying, harassment policies. They are the biggest barrier to humans delivering.
But can you get away with them? I mean, can you get rid of them?
Oh my goodness, yes. I mean, I have what I call mass shredding exercises, Roddy. So if you look at I'm working with the BBC, Next, Burberry, big banks, TSB. We've won a big.
But, I mean, the BBC clearly has its regulatory, problems, challenges.
But one of the things that the BBC sort of recognise and have now recognised across the whole of the corporation, having rolled out a pilot scheme in Scotland and across news, was that the grievance procedure singly from every perspective, employee, manager, union and leader perspective, was causing harm in the workplace. It was reductive. It was reducing complexity to simple black or white, win, lose, right, wrong approaches. It was reactive. It came in very late in the day. And it was transactional. They tried to transact between these two opposing forces. So by removing the grievance procedure, and in other organizations, the grievance and disciplinary procedures, what the organization is moving towards is a system whereby we can design a solution around the parties by understanding what the people's needs are. We've created a decision-making matrix called a triaging system or the resolution index, so we can make better decisions about which way to go. Now, the old systems that we've seen in organizations follow a very broad quasi-legal system, stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, and there's an escalatory process. I call those the ladder to the precipice of doom, because for most people it is. And for most people on the ladder to the precipice of doom, if we get a solution at any of those stages, it's pure luck. We haven't trained the managers on how to do it, so we can't say well done manager unless you intuitively know how to do it, because we sending them on a course in 1996 called a half-day program on difficult conversations does not cut through how to do this stuff very well. So that didn't work. Going to HR certainly doesn't work, because now it's going to turn into an absolute massive complexity, investigative, suspension, fear, sword of Damocles. So the systems of the past haven't served anyone. And what the BBC said, and so many organizations have said similarly, is they don't serve the needs of the organization as it exists, and they don't serve the needs of the organization as we seek to exist in the future. So by moving those processes into what I call an integrated people policy or an IPP and merging them, so we have all of these siloed processes, there's one single framework for addressing a wide array of individual challenges, shifting the HR function to a more modern people and culture function, introducing objective decision-making processes rather than the Wild West that exists in most HR and ER teams, People say to me it's compliance and consistency. But there's no compliance or consistency, because if you've got an allegation of bullying and person A deals with it, person B will deal with it very differently, and person C similarly. There's no consistency or compliance. There's no oversight, there's no scrutiny or governance unless you go to an appeal or you go to court, to tribunal to test it. So by building in a stronger oversight system, decision-making process, governance framework, we can merge these processes together and have one single overarching people experience that focuses on resolving issues constructively through dialogue and mediation and coaching and the kind of things we know everybody talks about being useful. But the only time they ever get brought in, Roddy, is when things have got so bad that these are wheeled in as some kind of a silver bullet, and everyone knows probably it's not going to work. But why aren't we using these processes as early as possible and designing in dialogue and compassion and learning and insight, not just as a bolt-on into the process, but as a core feature of the way that the organization's working? So the BBC have adopted this. We're rolling it out across the corporation. Numerous organizations now are embedding this through the private, public, and also the not-for-profit sector. Oxfam have introduced it within the organisation. So, and in my upcoming book, I share over 30 stories from organisations who are really doing this stuff a lot better, because the unitarist systems of the past are legacy systems that never really worked. They don't really work, and unfortunately, they ain't going to work in the future.
It's extraordinary that we got to that position, really. I mean, I was saying, the sort of the characteristic or what makes human beings special as a species is our ability to collaborate. We can function in large groups successfully, and the organization, whether it's a business, a charity, a government department, whatever it is the sort of modern manifestation of that. We can achieve far more in an organized organization, structured organization, than we could do just as a bunch of individuals. So, and yet we seem to forget that our main function is to collaborate in those organizations. I mean, that's what we're there to do. And of course, when the collaboration breaks down, what you need to do is to mediate it, as you say. And we've created this sort of rules-based system, as you're describing, which exacerbates the problem usually rather than reduces it. So there's this human-centered approach of dealing with it much more, being more empathetic early on, spotting these things, and presumably part of that is creating a culture, a psychologically safe culture where people feel confident enough to air their grievance before it's become, a significant issue. Is that the sort of holy grail that we're aiming for?
It is. I mean, the only thing I disagree with, you said usually creates it. I'd say always creates the conditions for a worsening of a relationship. I've never met anyone who's ever gone through a grievance procedure and come out of the other side of it and said, yes, that is the best thing I could have possibly done. I'm more productive. I'm happier at work, more harmonious. I've been doing this for 30 years. Well, it's a long time of going into organizations and going into those basements and listening to the stories. I've got a team of 100 consultants working across the globe, and I'm constantly getting information in, and I'm still waiting for that one person to share with me the example of gone through a formal process. So who's benefiting?
Well, the lawyers, obviously, who eventually get involved.
It's a very, very, very interesting point that you've just made, and I'm really enjoying seeing some great law firms out there now are starting to challenge this and recognizing that there's always going to be a place for litigation, Roddy. I've got 3 children. If something terrible happened to those, I would want to reserve the right to go to litigation. Litigation is a fundamentally important part of our justice system. But what litigation has done is it's sort of permeated into the system, into that sort of societal framework that you've described. So I see employee handbooks. Employee handbook. Hi, David. It's so lovely to have you in our organisation. Welcome. It's really good to have you here. It says, and a slightly faded CEO signature, but it's still a nice message. page 2, this is what we do when you are underperforming. This is what we do when you bully, when you are bullied, when you turn up late, when you break our IP code, when you wear the wrong clothes, when you speak inappropriately to manager. So basically, we don't trust you and you are a risk and things are going to break down. So I then take my risk register and I've gone off to other people. You said lawyers, and I'm pretty confident I would agree with you there, but there may be others that would go to too. And we take our risk and we say, okay, how do we mitigate that risk? And what we've done is we've created a risk mitigation system in the organization, which is only serving itself and those people who administer the risk mitigation system. It doesn't mitigate risk. And this is the paradox. This is the deep paradox of work. It worsens the risk. It creates further risk. It creates further harm for our employees. There's a great piece of work being done by a gentleman called Andrew Cooper, who's focused on a book, on a piece of work called Reducing Employee Harm. So there's a real evidence base. There's some work done by a consultant in the NHS called Chris Turner, who set up a program called Civility Saves Lives, looking at incivility and civility in the NHS. And we're starting to see some really powerful research that's showing the paradox of the systems and processes in our workplaces. The ones designed to reduce risk are the ones that are creating the biggest risk. Now, this might be going a bit too far, but it's Friday afternoon. We're on a podcast, so we might as well have an explanation. But could I write an employee handbook like this? Dear manager, when you are dealing with an issue, don't cause harm. Do no harm. That's my first one. When you're dealing with an issue, look, stay within the law. And if you're not sure about what the law is, give us a ring and we can help you out with it. Oh, and by the way, we've got some values in our organization. They're really important. They help provide, if you like, the scaffolding around the way that we work and we treat each other. So just follow the values if you wouldn't mind. Do no harm, operate within the law, follow the values. There's your employee handbook. I've written it in 3 lines. But I see employee handbooks that you have to chop down a Brazilian rainforest.
Even if someone is diligent enough to read through it, 3 weeks later, they'll remember 2 things out of it, basically.
And when do you read
and have that sense of, oh Lord, the world's after me, or the organisation is anyway.
You have to be a barrister. So it's been really fascinating. The tail end of 2025 has been fascinating because more and more of my clients are starting to get AI-generated grievances and formal complaints put into place. And they're written as though they're written by junior barristers. I mean, they're beautifully, elegant, wonderfully written grievance procedures, but entirely written by AI. So what the organisation is doing then is saying, okay, well, they've got this AI-generated 20,000-word grievance. So what we need to do is assimilate it and respond. I tell you what we'll do. We'll put it into ChatGPT and get a response. So you've got these 2 functions. You remember I talked about the unitarist perspective and the unitarist epoch of work when you had these 2 functions, if you like, the employee and the employer in this state of perpetual kind of conflict. We're now seeing this where that conflict is being defined by AI. So employee says, create my grievance. Employer says, respond to grievance in AI. And I'm like, well, where's the human being? Have we lost the plot here? Where's the human being in this process? And to an extent, whilst the evidence is stark and it's clear, the burnout in the HR teams, the sheer frustration that I see within management populations of just wanting to have the conversation but being blocked, and the rise of AI and the kind of nonsensical way that we're dealing with issues in the workplace are all coalescing to this sense of real turbulent change, which I see as one of the greatest opportunities for leaders, for managers, and for people professionals in particular, to become, for me, strategically the most important function in our organizations. Removing that handbook, changing it, and actually creating spaces to facilitate and enable and nurture the conversations and the dialogue that releases the creativity and the innovation and the learning and the insight. Wow. And that, I think, is just a massive opportunity for us all to lean into.
I mean, you said it was a sort of idealistic version of your half-page employee handbook. But I mean, how close to that have you seen people?
Very, very close. So we're going to look. I think one of the experiments that I do, and your listeners may wish to do this, is a nice experiment. It's a really, really nice. It works really well. So take a green pen and a red pen. And with a red pen, mark all of the parts. Just choose a policy out of your employee handbook. I mean, I'm going to suggest Grievance because that is the one that really. But anyway, it's like no one benefits. But anyway, take a policy of your choosing, and with a red pen, mark all of the bits which are about formality, blame, retribution, sanction, bureaucracy, division, all of the kind of elements that I'm describing. Invoking fear. You might go into a bit of neuroscience if you wanted to. They might evoke a cortisol response or a fight or flight response. That's your red pen. With a green pen, staying on the kind of neuroscience perspective, I might say, okay, with a green pen, which bits of your policy are sort of releasing dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, endorphins? They're generating flow. We work in here again on Daniel Pink's work, Martin Seligman's work around flow and creativity. We start to think about what parts of the policy are generating dialogue, understanding, learning, creativity, and insight. Now, generally, when I start working with an organization, Roddy, one might get a little depressed because you might just see one dot of green and pages, swathes of red, swathes of it. And then I go out and I speak to people. I do focus groups. I do listening exercises, isn't it? It's nothing. It's not rocket science. You just go and hear what people are saying, and they're reinforcing that it's running hot and it's oppressive and it's traumatizing and it's harmful and it's difficult. We can't get rid of the red pen. Nor should we get rid of the red pen. There has to be a structure. We have to be compliant. There has to be regulation. But the best policies have an equal balance of the green pen and the red pen. And so the best policy, my simplistic one, was probably for dramatic effect. What I'm suggesting is you should have an equal balance of the red and the green. And when you get that sense of, excuse the sort of cliche description of harmony within the framework, that sense of harmony within the policy then sort of starts to move out across the organization. So we've got our leaders leading from the top, our managers and creating the climate, as I described earlier, through the behaviors, actions, and interactions. And in the middle of the organization is a rules-based system and a policy framework which is centered around harmony, regulation, compliance, power, authority, control, in harmony with values, purpose, the needs of our people, and the sort of desire to be able to help places for them to flourish. That harmony then acts as, if you like, a fulcrum point or a pivot point within the organization, and it holds things together. And in that moment, I think, where the people functions transition into this much more progressive and, from their perspective, much more enjoyable way of working, if I could put it that way, it starts to then, that's now your culture starting to shape and transform.
I'm just really struck by that, the way you set that up earlier about you join an organization, you get given the employee handbook, and everything is essentially negative about it. Do you think that sets a tone within the organization instantly? And if you can provide an employee handbook which is far less sort of rules and punishment based, then you already are creating a more optimistic and innovative and energetic sense.
Without a doubt whatsoever. People are not stupid. We're smart. We can, and so what you might do is you look at, so this is an employee handbook. This is my handbook. This is a guide for my employment. I might look and go, that's just a typical classic employee handbook. Therefore, I'm going to shelve it. So the only time I'm going to get it out is when there's a problem. What it's supposed to, it's called a handbook, not a problem-solving device. So, and of course, it's not going to solve the problem. I've already suggested it's going to make it worse. So when we move from a handbook to, say, an employee guide, and starting to shift the language, and this is some people when I'm talking with them, the shift from HR to people and culture, disciplinary warnings to reminders, performance improvement plans to agreed action plans, the shift from an employee handbook to an employee guide, moving from probation, unless you're Timpsons and you're actively seeking to employ recent released offenders in your workplace. I'm guessing most people haven't come in with a tag on their ankle, so they're not on probation. They're on boarding. We're settling them in. We're working together. So, and people say to me, "Yeah, this is just words, David. This is just like fancy rebranding of some of these old processes." And my response to them when they say that to me, Roddy, is this very simple: language drives mindset. Mindset drives behavior. Behavior drives outcome. Now, outcome is about delivering a positive customer experience and an employee experience. So to your point about the documentation, if the words on the documents suggest that I'm a risk and you don't trust me and you're going to have a set of policies that will cause me harm, and let's be honest, let's be absolutely 100% honest here, house always wins. You've just been dealt a card the minute you walked into the casino. It's called the employee handbook. The croupier is the HR department. House always wins. And so you've just been already dealt the card, the card. You've been dealt the hand, and it's saying, I don't trust you. No wonder we don't trust each other. It's like, it's crazy.
And they've presumably just spent quite a considerable amount of time, even more money, on selecting that person in the first place. And then you treat them like that. And then as you say, there's this lack of trust and an imposition of command and control. An employee handbook is command and control, basically, isn't it? These are the rules, and this is what happens if you go against them, which is exactly the leadership style that we are all trying to put behind us. So there is an obvious dissonance there between what's being done and what's people are hoping for. But it's like insurance, though. I fear, isn't it, that if someone offers you insurance for anything, you suddenly go, oh my God, well, I don't have that. I better have that. And as soon as it's been aired, you sort of say, well, you sort of embrace it, or if not embrace it, but you're fearful of not doing it. And if these rules are in place, then it seems quite a bold move. I'm not saying it's a bad move at all, but it is a bold move to remove them and then say, no, we're going to go with this entirely different approach.
I agree. I think it's really interesting. And you talked about the dissonance. So, you speak to many leaders and managers. I'm not saying that we'd seen the demise of hierarchy and autocracy, but, and I think there are evidence on a global basis that autocracy seems to be taking precedence.
It seems to be having a bit of a boom period.
It seems to be having a bit of a boom. It's like, it's back in town. So, who am I to say that autocracy is not the preferred style? But I know I'm going to keep
it's not creating happiness
close to my chest. But listen, I think you probably got a sense of where I come. Are we seeing the demise of hierarchy and autocracy in organizations? We're certainly seeing a move towards distributed leadership, the rise of transformational leadership, the rise of coaching conversations, the rise of dialogue, the rise of understanding that I need a team with skills and capabilities that I can resource and support. So I see this language within the C-suite. I see a recognition that culture and people are an asset within the organization, that we need to value that asset, that we're expressing our outcome through shareholder value, but also through strategic value and social value and stakeholder value. So I see this big conversation going on in our boardrooms and executive suites. I've got to be honest with you, it's phenomenally exciting. And then I see this structure within the organization that feels like it's the antithesis of what we're seeing now. And it just feels, for the people function, and this is where I think chief people officers play such an important role, Roddy. And my book is a memo to the CPO, really. And it's saying, look, you've got legacy systems which you've inherited, and I don't think they were great, if I'm honest with you, but I get it. You've inherited them and they are where they are. But if you want to have not a strategic seat at the table, but if you want to become the table around which people are sitting, I talk about this oracular HR function, this oracle, this strategic seer within our workplace. And you want to have that space that you are widely trusted from the exec through to the workforce. You need to start listening to the language your exec are using. You need to start thinking about what your managers need in terms of skills and capabilities. And you need to restructure the systems and processes of work around those different emergent needs. But when you start to do so, yes, it takes some courage to do the first step. And I might wish I could just wheel in a great big shredding machine and just start to get to work on your procedures. Let's be absolutely honest, it probably won't happen. But it can happen. But if you have a kind of diagnostic and a bit more of an evidence-based approach, it's not as scary because the evidence is. So to give you an example, I've created a resolution framework as an alternative to the discipline and grievance procedures. I talked about that's what the BBC have adopted. And I did some research earlier this year when we were building on the research base for next year because it was really interesting. So one of the things that people say to me, David, is, look, we're going to introduce your resolution framework, but it's a bit of a risk. I need to be bold and courageous, and but I'm opening up myself to risk. So we did some research of organizations' exposure to risk in the employment tribunals. That's the big fear, the tribunals, of course, being the place where we test cases in UK. Not one organization had adopted the resolution framework, not one, and we're talking big organizations, had an adverse outcome in the courts or the tribunals as a result of adopting the resolution framework. Not one single organization. And I launched it in 2013, Roddy, and I'm pretty confident that had an organization gone to tribunal and had a junior barrister rip them to shreds, and they had a compensation award in the tribunal because of a failure to follow due process, procedural justice, ACAS code, I'm pretty confident I would have got a notification in my inbox telling me, David, your process has just given me exposure to a massive compensation award in the tribunal. Not one single organization came back and said that they had an adverse outcome in the tribunal. So I'm fascinated by that. I'm thinking, well, hang on, is it as bold and courageous, or is it just that we've just fallen into some really, really bad habits? And if I want to stop, I don't smoke, by the way, but if I wanted to stop smoking or drinking or gambling, maybe it's not the courage of stopping those bad habits. It's the courage of acknowledging I have a bad habit in the first place. And that takes real courage. I don't think the transition to not smoking, not gambling, not drinking is the problem. I probably might live a bit longer. It's the courage that's required to look inward and acknowledge I've got a problem, and we need to acknowledge we've got a problem.
The other part about conflict is, of course, and we've been discussing when it's got to a crisis situation and how we can possibly stop that before it. But I always like the analogy given to me that conflict is like water. You can't actually live without it. In the right quantities, conflict is hugely beneficial. It's creative. It's stimulating. It gets you to look in different directions. But if you have too much of it, then it's hugely destructive. So the water analogy being, we need to irrigate our fields and we need to drink water. And without it, we perish. But obviously, floods and typhoons are no good for anyone. So what's your perspective around enabling conflict, but maintaining it at a positive level rather than a negative one?
Well, it's a beautiful analogy, Roddy, the water analogy. So I kind of got a couple of books here. It was in my book, Managing Conflict. So it starts off managing conflict. Sorry, was that an obvious book plug?
Yeah, no, that's good. That's good. It matches the color of my backdrop. So
it does actually.
We're all good. Yeah.
But that's but it starts off. I'm a massive fan of conflict.
Yeah.
I thought your analogy was really very beautiful, because I think it speaks to the incredibly constructive and functional power of conflict, but also the destructive and dysfunctional force of it. How might we carry your metaphor forward? Can I stop the typhoon? Maybe by doing a bit less global warming, perhaps. Can I stop the sea? Maybe not, but I can start to think about how I manage the tides. But what I can do is create spaces whereby we can use that water in a really positive way. And what does that actually look like in an organization or in a community? So from my background, when I first set out in my journey, was in community relations, community cohesion. My degree was in race relations. Race and community relations. So I was very interested in intolerance, racism, discrimination within society. So I looked at it first in communities, and then latterly for the last 25 years at work. And what I've learned through those conversations is picking up the carrying on the water theme. So we could talk about sailing, couldn't we, and how we sail, and we kind of sort of sail on those lakes. But for me, it's about when we manage conflict constructively and lean into that, and when managers give their people a jolly good listening to. When we start to remove that defensiveness, because the best form of defense in most organizations and societies that I work in, and communities, the best form of defense is attack. So when we move that dynamic, attack and defend, blame, right, wrong, win, lose, all of the sort of, if you like, the malfunction or the dysfunction, if you will, as Patrick Lencioni talks about it, the 5 dysfunctions of the team, which is a fantastic book, by the way. So when we think about those dysfunctions becoming almost embedded in the organization, and we see the breakdown of trust, that's people's felt experience of conflict. And they're just so shocked and so blown away by the power of someone listening to them. People, I've been mediating all my life. I love mediation. It gives me joy whenever I get the chance to do it. And one of the things that people always say to me they find beneficial from mediation, is the resolution, and it's all of the positive side of it. But the thing they find so powerful is that someone listened to them. And in the first instance, as a mediator, it's me. And then latterly, they move into a conversation with one another and start having a dialogue and listening to each other. And it feels like the need to be heard, the need to feel valued and respected, is profoundly powerful. It's a deeply human need. And when that need isn't fulfilled, it creates this vacuum of animosity and suspicion. So to move into that sort of space of the water nourishing us and fulfilling us and keep sustaining us, and taking that analogy into, if you like, practical tools that a manager and a people professional can give, it's be curious. Ask those open questions. Why, how, where, when, what's going on? Being empathetic. No, this doesn't mean empathy has got a bit of a bad rep and it's a bit of a PR agent. It doesn't mean we're all going to agree with everything that you've said. And it doesn't mean I have to feel your pain. And, we have to go into some deeply sort of psychotherapeutic place. It simply says, I can kind of get what's going on for you, Roddy. I kind of see you're feeling a bit frustrated and upset. And I can get, tell me why you feel that way. What do you need to happen to make you feel less upset and more happy, less frustrated, more satisfied, less disrespected and more respected, less undervalued and more valued and supported in your workplace? So I can reframe that dysfunction into function through the listening. And those are practical tools that I use as a mediator every day. And if there's one thing I would love to think I would do, when I look back on my career, is just share those with every manager, everyone I meet, because we can all do. You don't need someone like me, or mediators are amazing, by the way. So do use a mediator, but we don't need a mediator to help create the conditions for positive, constructive conflict, as you set out in the question.
I mean, so much of it is having that ability and that mental capacity to see the other side of the argument or the other viewpoint. You don't need to agree with it, but you need to be able to recognize that it exists. And that actually is quite a skill to for many people to embrace, particularly if you're very sort of if you're the kind of personality that sees things very clearly in a sort of black and white kind of way.
Just to come in on that, because people often say that to me, it's difficult. We talk about neurodivergent, sometimes it's harder, and I'm not totally convinced I buy into it. And I think there are different levels of empathy. There's affective empathy, where we're kind of getting more deeply emotionally involved, and then there's more cognitive empathy, the sort of think and thought kind of empathy. So I can say to you, Roddy, I think what I think I'm intuiting, just trying to put myself in your shoes for a second, is you're thinking time's a really important aspect, and I wish this guy would give shorter answers to a question so we could get through more questions. I think that's what I'm sort of seeing. So I'm intuiting now. What you need is this. Now, I'm not really feeling your pain, but I'm telling you, and you might say, oh my God, this guy's really going to get this. And then you have this conversation based on empathy. So I don't think it's as hard as we need it to be to apply a bit of cognitive empathy. And what I also see, and I think I'm just going to sort of make my PR case for this, if you don't mind, is when you look at a problem through the lens of another, you will make a better decision. So it's not removing your ability to make decisions, to reach determinations, to apply logic and judgment. It doesn't remove those. My argument to you as a decision maker is you will make a better decision if you consider the impact of the decision through the eyes of another person. So suddenly your decision making is bringing in empathy as one of the dimensions. And now we're starting to see empathy becoming a really powerful, useful tool. So I hear people say it's very hard, and I sometimes know it's very hard. It's very easy not to. I'm not so sure it is so hard Absolutely.
You're probably right that it's easy not to, but it's not actually that difficult. But there is a set of skills. I mean, there are questions that you can ask of yourself and of others that get you moving down that road. And once you do that, and once you have those at your disposal, then it becomes relatively straightforward, I suspect. But you have to, like all these things, get into the habit of doing them and know what they are in the first place, trying to stand in someone else's shoes and look at it from a different perspective.
Therein lies the gauntlet laid down at the door of the people team. Because if we're not equipped, so if we've had this conversation between the two of us now, and people might be agreeing or disagreeing, people have their own views on this, of course. But if those people are agreeing, the next question has to be, at what point are we giving these tools to our managers and recognizing that they're a core component for the people between those people who are out there leading, managing? Because if they are fundamentally important and critical to the good running of an organization, then ultimately we are acting in a way which I would say, by withholding those skills and centralizing everything through to these functions, let's call it an HR function, but withholding the skills for management, it's negligent. We're putting our managers in a position of deep trauma for themselves. We're not giving them the tools. You wouldn't send someone down a mine and not give them a hat and a pickaxe, yet we put managers in just they assume that they've got the tools. So to your point about it, them needing to have the skills, that is a call to action for the learning and development team. And I work with L&D teams and say, let's get your L&D catalog out. And just where does empathy sit, and how can we make empathy sit across your entire suite of courses? I did it in schools when I was working in schools. And one of the really great things I enjoyed doing was getting empathy into every part of the curriculum in a community college in Leicester. And I was working with the science teachers about how to get empathy into science. And we were talking about Watson and Crick's and the sort of finding of the DNA double helix. And whilst they may or may not have been on various things to help them think more clearly, they were able to almost imagine themselves in the double helix. And I think that ability to put themselves into the double helix helped them to imagine that, and whether or not there was any mind-altering influence as part of that and other people supporting it, of course we need to acknowledge that. But nonetheless, my point is that empathy was powerful in helping to establish and understand the nature of the DNA double helix.
But they are sort of basic skills there, and that, I mean, my premise is that, you know, we promote people from technical expertise into leadership roles, but we give them no preparation for what's required in those leadership roles. And these things, they're not massively complicated, but they're a new set of skills, and they're a very different set of skills. And people need the space to practice them and to be made aware of them. And you know, the phrase I'm sort of increasingly coming to around this is, you know, silent sabotage. So we're silently sabotaging our organizations by failing to give people these processes, these tools to deal with these kinds of situations, because none of them are ever mission critical in as much as you don't have to get them done today in order to close the deal, you know, get the truck loaded and out of the warehouse or whatever it is. They can always be pushed off till tomorrow, and then tomorrow comes and you've got another set of operational issues you've got to deal with. And so they never quite get to the top of the pile. And it's that silent sabotage that I think is, you know, we started off this conversation around productivity, and I think that's, you know, that's undermining it.
And it's not okay. It's just, I mean, it's flatly not okay. You know, I think I've worked in so many organizations, I'm sure so many people have, is I've listened to the mental health issues. So there's a fly buzzing around in my office. And it was a very sort of weird time for fly in December. So anyway, we've got a guest, so forgive me. I've heard the harrowing stories, you know, from very serious mental health and trauma through to regular sickness. And I spoke to someone once who talked to me about having bricks in the belly whenever she comes into work. People are physically sick in the workplaces, people who can't go into work, they're off work for weeks and months, significant impact, eczema flare-ups, irritable bowel, sore shoulders, sore backs, and biological, physiological, as well as the psychological harm. So whilst it may not show up on the metrics of that particular, but we might be everyone's having to work harder because people are off sick or we're getting covering, those costs are showing up. Roddy, £28 billion a year is lost to the UK economy due to this stuff, according to the arbitration service ACAS, who researched. That's £1,000 per employee. Now, Rachel Reeves, who's obviously trying to, going back to our economic arguments, trying to drive, could say, okay, what can we do to harness that? Of that £28 billion, this is the shocking statistic. It's a call to action. Less than 1% of that £28 billion is spent on processes that promote dialogue, mediation, and coaching. Less than 1%. Now, again, it's a rhetorical question. I'll let you answer it if you wish. Where the heck is that other 99% going?
The answer is, it's not really going anywhere, is it? I mean,
it's just stuck. It's not economically adding any value. I've never met an MD or a CEO, a CTO, CFO, COO who could possibly be happy with that. If you've got private equity funders, they're not going to be happy with it. You've got a board, they're not going to be happy with it.
Probably one of the major causes of driving.
That's another very interesting conversation. And I've asked that question. I mentioned the 2 podcasts I've done this week with the CPO CEO, with Shaw Gibbs and Agena Group. And I asked that specific question because they were both PE backed, and both the CEOs said that wasn't the case, which was interesting. I also wondered how much impact the PE and backers had in terms of creating a culture which was about profit over people. And both of the answers, funnily enough, and like I say, it was 2 answers, so I'm going to take it as a trend and a pattern, which was no, they let us get on and run the organisation, and we see culture as an asset that gives them their return on investment. So that was their answer, Roddy. I simply relay it.
I don't know the individuals you're talking about. I say this in an unbiased fashion, but it serves them not to dismiss their backers either.
I take your view on it. I hear you loud and clear. I think took that view, and that's why I specifically asked that question. So who knows? But I certainly think that
one's far better off to ask these questions of people once they're out of their role. You always get far straighter answers from former politicians than you do from current politicians.
And not on a LinkedIn Live podcast like I was running, where they kind of speak into the world and to everyone who's listening. So I think that would be an authentic and genuine. I'm not going to diminish it. I think but there were some interesting forces at play. And I think my sort of summarizing our workforce is we can let those forces at play dominate the nature of work and dominate it for the future, but your organization will lose competitive advantage in the marketplace. You'll lose customers, investor sentiment will go down, your workforce will be impacted, you'll lose the people you want to keep, you'll keep the people you want to lose, you won't attract the top talent. Or a people and culture first approach is going to help you reverse that, as we talked about some of the data and the statistics. So I think for organizations who are shaping their strategic plans now for 2026 into 2027, starting to think about what they want their organizations. My message is very simple: people, culture and leadership at the top of your agenda, and keep it there every single day. And it will help you to flourish and thrive and succeed.
I am very happy to endorse that as a closing sentiment for our discussion. David Liddle, it's been a joy and a pleasure having a conversation with you. Thank you very much indeed.
Absolutely. Apologies about the fly buzzing around. I don't know if it showed up at all. But it was
speak with you both.
It was very happy to be here. So thank you from me and the fly. But Roddy, it's been an absolute joy as well. I've really enjoyed the conversation. I'm always happy to have conversations about these topics because I think we need to get them out into open those conversations. But Roddy, no, thank you for inviting me and to be part of today's podcast.
Superb. David, thank you.